Hello, welcome to Terrific Thursdays. We are now getting towards the end of the book of Revelation. Today we're going to be looking at chapters 15 through 16, and these are known as the seven bowls. And sometimes you'll hear the seven vials. And what you really have here, these are the very final judgments of the tribulation, that period that's going to last for 7 years. So finally, we're getting right down towards the end. And these really are the most severe judgments that the world is ever going to see. They're the most severe judgments that the world has ever seen up to this point. These judgments are pretty well described in Revelation 16, verses 1 through 21, and they're called the seven bowls of God's wrath. So every time one of these bowls gets poured out, just want you to picture this is God's wrath getting poured out, because that's exactly what it is. And again, this is right at the end of the tribulation. So if you've ever been to a big fireworks display, usually at the end, the fireworks are all just really going off big time, and they kind of save the best for last. Well, in this case, fireworks are going off big time, but we're saving the worst for last. So what's happening is the world is now under the spell of the Antichrist, and man's wickedness is just going rampant all over the place. And this is meeting with God's wrath, and he's angry because people have not listened, people have broken the covenant, people have been into idolatry, and basically people have gone in the wrong direction. And so when you look almost at most of humanity in the history, this really kind of meets the peak of about the worst that it's going to get. Debauchery and everything that's anti-God. It's just a terrible, terrible time. So these seven bowls are called forth by the seventh trumpet, which we looked at. And so that's the seventh trumpet is also calling now for these bowls to be poured out. And that's the thought to have when you're thinking of the bowls, is they're being taken and they're being poured out in a variety of different places. So you might ask, well, who's pouring them out? And the answer, according to this with John, is angels are doing that. And all the things that you're going to see here, if you say to yourself, well, seems like I've seen that before, these are very similar to the plagues that we find in Egypt. So the people that say that this book, Revelation, reflects history that's already happened, this is where one of the places where they point to that, because these are plagues that are very similar that you've heard of before when we have the children of Israel, and that the Pharaoh won't let them go. So we've got these seven bowls. Again, seven's that magic number of completion. It's the perfect number. And so none of that is lost on these last judgments right at the very end again of the tribulation. So the first bowl is poured out on the land, and sores break out on all of those who have 666 on their forehead or on their right hand. Anybody that has that is going to be just loaded up with sores. And the target here is anybody who has been following the Antichrist is going to incur God's wrath. So the first bowl is poured out on the land. The second bowl is poured out on the sea. And here we have a description of water turning into blood. The next thing we find is that the ocean is dead. And already 1/3 of the ocean is gone. Remember when we heard the second trumpet blow? So now there's not much left of the ocean. There's only a third. It was a third then and a third now, and a third left. Then the third bowl is poured into rivers, and fresh water now also turns into blood. So you're beginning to see that the drinking water, the ability to be able to quench your thirst, is getting smaller and smaller as we go along. So the fourth bowl is poured out on the sun, and people that are there are scorched by fire. And the curses of God are given to them because they don't repent. So picture these people getting scorched by the hot, hot sun and with fire. The fifth bowl is now poured out on the kingdom of the beast, and the beast has now plunged into darkness. And what's happening is pain and suffering are being given to those who are a part of the Antichrist. And it makes a comment in here, if you can kind of picture this, that things get so bad that they start gnawing, chewing on, eating their tongues. And this just shows the wickedness of the infidels. Six is kind of a strange one. And again, it goes back to Old Testament prophecy being fulfilled. This one talks about this bowl is being poured on the Euphrates River, and it dries up. And there are three unclean spirits that look like frogs, and we find the Antichrist, that these frogs are coming out of his mouth. And so in essence, what's happening is the Antichrist is leading people astray by telling lies, half-truths, anything that he can do to lead people astray. But you get this picture of all this junk, all this croaking that's going on by the Antichrist. And so that's the sixth one to be poured out. So obviously 7 is the magic number, so we've got one bowl, one vial that's left. And this one is poured out on the atmosphere. And kind of almost sounds like Jesus on the cross. There's a voice from heaven that after this seventh one is poured out, there's a voice from heaven that says, "It is done." So in other words, that's the end of tribulation. But what happens when before God says it is done, there's a flash of lightning and an earthquake that is the most severe earthquake that this world has ever seen. When you see the Richter scale, it's not enough to measure this earthquake that's going to be unlike any others. And then the angel shows John's judgment on Babylon. And again, those who say that this is finished history would point to this judgment of Babylon, because we knew when we were reading about the Babylonian captivity that God used Babylon as an instrument of his justice, but he also made the statement that they were at some point going to have to pay for killing the people of Israel, the Jewish nation, the Jewish people. And so, time to pay the piper, Babylon. And so God decides that anybody that's killed his saints, anybody that's killed his faithful, that this is a time that they're going to have to pay. So we knew that that was coming at some point in history, that Babylon was going to be destroyed, even though God had used them as an instrument of allowing the Israelites to do what they needed to do. And so finally they are finished. And so now the millennium is almost upon us. We've had the rapture where Jesus takes the church, the faithful, dead and alive, up to be with him in heaven. And then we have this tribulation period, this long period of time. And now that tribulation is over. And everybody sighs with relief. It is over. Or as God says from heaven, it is done. So that was the next phase in his plan. We've had the three different waves of things. We now have the tribulation is finished. You've had this battle between good and evil, and now God has put forth his final vengeance, his final wrath, as we've opened up these seven vessels, these seven vials, these seven bowls, and he's poured out wrath and misery upon all of those who have made the wrong choices and followed the Antichrist, all those who are evil, all of those who have not turned and repented. He's really letting them have it right now. And if you were in that boat, you'd be saying to yourself, can it get any worse? And each day gets worse and worse. With the opening of each one of these vials, it gets worse and worse. Until finally now, tribulation is closed. It's finished. And now it's time for the third very big important phase that comes along. And you know what that is? That's what we've all waited for. Now we're going to be talking about the second coming of Jesus. The same Jesus who came at Bethlehem, the same Jesus who rose from the dead, the same Jesus who was on earth for 40 days after that, showing himself, the same Jesus who ascended to sit at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. And before he leaves, he tells his church, he tells his disciples, he tells the world that God has a plan, and that someday, sometime, at the Father's choice, he is going to come back again. So that's the next big chapter in this book called the Book of Life, in the way that God has designed this planet. So now it's time for that event that we have waited for and waited for and waited for. It's time for Jesus to come back in the same way that he left. Just as he foretold, just as he prophesied, just as God's plans dictate. So when we meet on Friday, it's all looking pretty good, as long as you're a faithful person. And if you're not, then the end is near. And the end of the story is going to find itself on two different tracks. And you're going to see a lot of people on one track. You're going to see a lot of people going on another track. I'll give you a hint. One track goes up and one track goes down. And so we're going to see how all that plays out tomorrow as we finish up the book of Revelation. Now, tomorrow we will not be having a Bible study, since we've been using this kind of all week to finish up the book of Revelation, to give everybody a little better understanding, particularly if you're reading the Grand Sweep. Now you've had a nice overview, and you should be in a position to kind of take a look at this book and see what you think about the book. How does it speak to you? What has God told you as we've been going through all these different pages, all these different phases of the book of Revelation? And then I'm going to share with you a little bit of my perspective as a pastor, and just kind of leave it there. And as my seminary professor used to always say, you're going to have to pay your money and take your choice, and decide what you think about this book of Revelation, and then make it your own. Put that in your heart and your soul and your mind, and that's going to be your understanding. That's going to be your mantra for the future. And so I hope that you've enjoyed this. Probably not so much so for these 4 days, but tomorrow I think you're going to really enjoy it, because there's a lot of good news after all these woes and all of these wraths and all of these judgments. Now we're going to get to the really good stuff. So stick with me one more day, and we'll finish up the book of Revelation. And then I hope that you will join us on Sunday as we have our communion celebration. If you're going to be watching, well, we're going to do communion one more time. at home. So I'm going to ask you to either get some grape juice or red wine, white wine, get some kind of a bread or a cracker or something like that. And we're going to have virtual communion as we've been having. And next month we will be able to hopefully take communion in a little different way and take it together in some smaller groups. We're working on that. So again, please be patient with us. We want to be sure that everything is safe before we reopen those doors. So we're working on plans. We're looking at all kinds of suggestions, and I think we're starting to work a little bit better. But again, we want to be just absolutely sure that everybody's safety is at an absolute maximum. There have been too many cases here of churches that have opened up too early and paid some terrible consequences. And we don't want to be one of those. So we're working hard, and we should pretty soon here have some ideas to what direction we're going to be going into for the next couple months or so. So, would you join me for a word of prayer? These are terrific days, these terrific Thursdays. It's a day that you've given to us, filled with all kinds of surprises from you, all kinds of God winks, all kinds of blessings. And sometimes when we find ourselves in difficult settings like this, we have a tendency to focus on the difficult setting rather than seeing all these things which are around us, not to mention the fact that you are there as Emmanuel with us. So before we panic, before we have let fear take over, just remind us that you're walking hand in hand with us. Remind us of who you are, and just remind us how important it is to learn to trust you. This is part of that trust walk of life that we understand, and that we just cherish the fact that you're there to walk hand in hand with us. You walk with us and you talk with us along life's way. And for that we give you thanks in Jesus' precious name. And everybody said, Amen.